This morning, I've kind of got a couple goals here in mind. There you go. I'm not picking it up a second time. There's a limit to grace, you know. One is to look at the history of Israel and give a broad overview of it. In other words, last week we ended with, what's his name? Elijah. I was going to say Elisha, and it just wasn't going back one guy. Elijah on Mount Carmel and King Ahab. So we need to come from that story forward about 200 years to the exile of Israel. The second thing I want to do is show how the history of Israel fits within the larger history of the world. Because when you read the biblical accounts, you really think it's, just about Israel and only about Israel. And as far as the rest of the nations of the world are concerned, is what do they think about Israel? I really want to put this within a larger context, because then that helps you see that when you read the biblical account, they're not so concerned with everything that's happening in the world. They're picking out specific actions, specific beliefs, specific things that Israel is doing and showing how that relates to their covenant with God. So they really want to use their history as a teaching or as a sort of a catechism type document, and not so much as a catalog of everything that happens. And then also want to look at why the covenant that God made with Israel in Exodus 20 and Leviticus and Deuteronomy is so significant later on. And I think I can go a little bit lighter on that because Steve did a great job on that this morning. One of my problems with Sunday school is always trying to figure out, I have to kind of divine, so I spend 2 days like this, thinking, okay, what is Eric or Steve or Don going to say off the text here? Yeah. Cell phones work. But I think I hit it pretty well this morning. Don I've got down pretty well. I can kind of look at a text and know what Don's going to talk about. Eric is a little bit trickier. But the first thing I wanted to do this morning is I've been talking to you about study Bibles and the value of having a good study Bible either on a tablet form or in print form. And Carla, I saw carrying in today her ESV study Bible, which is an excellent study Bible. And so do you want to just say a little bit about that for a second, Carla? You get the online with it. Oh, because the online version is great. I mean, it's like $39 just to get the online version. So picking up a nice study Bible, the ESV one is very good, very highly recommended. Will really help when you come to a text and you're like, what the heck is this about? Who is Ahab? Who is Ashurbanipal? Who is Tiglath-Pileser? Who is, who are these? Who is King So of Egypt? Who are these different people? And a study Bible like that will oftentimes fill in the background and the other information so that you know what's going on. So, with that in mind, we need to jump into our text today. Last week we looked at a little bit of history of Israel and what was taking place. So this is a chart from last week. And last week I looked at, after Solomon, how Israel and Judah split. And then you have a progression. I don't have all the kings. I just put the major ones up. Some of these kings only rule for a year or two. Some begin to rule, and then their son or their brother imprisons them. So even though they're still king, the other guy is on the throne. And so you get some overlap. So I've only put up the major figures here. But last week we got to King Ahab and this 3-year drought, which is not just documented in the Bible, but it's in Egyptian, Persian, Greek. It's in all the different literature that talks about this huge famine that swept through the world at that time. and Israel was part of it. And how in the very bottom, this is what the book of 1st and 2nd Kings concerns. Today what we need to do is move forward from there. So I've got kind of a second chronology chart to show you what's taking place here. And the first one is we're going to move on from Ahab and Jehu to Jeroboam, Pekah, and then Hoshea. And he's the king that we meet in 2 Kings chapter 17 that is the king of Israel that's going to lead or really bring about the exile of Israel, the destruction of Israel as a nation. So this is how he kind of fits in. We're going to go from around 900 BC with King Ahab up to really 722 BC when Israel is exiled and destroyed. On Judah's side, we have a number of kings. We have great jump in Jehoshaphat, Joash, Uzziah, Jotham, and then the key person for us who parallels Hoshea is King Ahaz in Israel. And I've got the 3-year famine kind of marked out there for you. And if you want to know how the different biblical books fit into this kind of period of time, this is the time when 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, this is what they're concerned about, the time frame that they're covering. We have the prophet Obadiah, who's going to come along and write during this time. One of the interesting ones is Jonah. Jonah pops in here, and Micah. Jonah's going to be the prophet that's going to be sent from Israel to go prophecy in Nineveh. And so Nineveh is the arch enemy of Israel, just about the arch enemy of everybody. And he is sent to Nineveh to prophecy there, and this is how he fits into the whole thing. But we don't have time to get into those people. We need to focus on some other issues here. Last week when we left off, this was sort of the state of the world nation-wise in the ancient Near East at that time. You had Israel in the red and Judah in the blue. They're the people we're concerned about. Probably the other nations that are important for us are the light blue, the Philistines. We're not going to talk about them much this week except to say goodbye to them. The Phoenicians, or Sidon, which is where King Ahab in Israel, remember he married Jezebel, the princess from Sidon, and formed an alliance with them. And then Aram, the green country up there, not only does Ahab form alliances with Sidon, but he also forms alliances with Aram. Now his alliances with Phoenicia or Sidon go fairly well. They get along pretty good. Aram is like the new administration comes in and all sorts of executive orders get signed and the relationship is destroyed. Then the next king comes in and all new executive orders and things are back. And so Aram and Israel kind of swing back and forth in their loyalty and their kind of relationship with each other. But that's kind of the state we had back then. Now, around the middle of the 8th century BC, what happens is in the very east, Nineveh, the Assyrian Empire is on its ascendancy. Prior to this, you had the Hittites in the north up in Turkey. They fell, and so there was really a big power vacuum to the north, and Egypt was weak. And so this allowed these little countries like Israel and Judah and Phoenicia and Sidon, to really develop. When the cat's away, the mice will play type thing. Well, what happens is around 850 BC, Nineveh comes on the map now. And it's really this one king, Shalmaneser III, and you only really need to know 2 kings for Nineveh for this story, Shalmaneser and Tiglath-Pileser. And the reason why I only need to know 2 is because you're going to get Shalmaneser III and Shalmaneser V. Tiglath-Pileser, I think, the second, and then Tiglath-Pileser the third. So you only need to know 2 names, and you got 4 kings covered. But it also makes history a little confusing this time, because you say Tiglath-Pileser, and you go, wasn't he in the 8th century? What's he doing in the 7th? They didn't live 120 years. Well, it's because you got, they're naming after their fathers and grandfathers and stuff like that. Shalmaneser III comes along, and he really rebuilds the Assyrian Empire. And he starts spreading north, south, east, and west. He really conquers much of modern-day Iraq and Persia. into parts of Turkey, and then he begins, his final expansion is to go west and south. And I've got a quote here from what's called the Kirk Stele, or it's called the Shalmaneser Stele. And I'll put up a picture for you here. It's about this tall, and it's inscribed with about 150 lines of text. It's got a picture, and then they carve cuneiform over top of it, lettering over top of it. But what's interesting is it's sort of a listing of what his accomplishments were. So you get these statements like, I drew near to Irhulene and Hamathi, however you say those. I'm not a great Hurrian or Assyrian expert. Parga and Argana, his royal cities. I brought out his body, his goods, and the treasure of his palaces. I set fire to his palaces. I departed from Argana and drew near to Karkar. I destroyed Karkar, his royal city, and set it on fire. And what you have here is a listing of his campaign going west, the cities that he's destroying as he's going west. And I was saying last week that Assyria is one of these countries that has one of the best military records, win-loss records on the books. And part of it is because they were so ruthless. Mercy was not in their category at all. If you resisted them, they destroyed your entire city. Everybody was taken off into captive, except for those who they thought might be really good when you go to the next city. And they would catapult you alive into the city, or they would set you on fire on a stake outside the city gate, so that everybody inside the city heard what was happening to aunts and uncles and brothers and relatives outside the city. And so you have an option: resist us, or you become the advertising material for the next city. So this is part of what he's writing about. Now, when he reaches Karkar, what happens is interesting, is we get a listing. He actually describes one of his military losses. It's actually not a loss, it's a stalemate. But he hits the city of Karkar, and you have an alliance of 10 kings from the south which come up and do battle against him. And they stop him from moving south. And what's really interesting is in this list, here's the Kirk Stele that I was telling you about with all these lines of text on both sides. There's a picture of Shalmaneser the Great up there. But on it, in about lines 95 and 96, he lists out the kings from the south and what they sent. So some of it's chipped off, but we get 1,200 chariots, 2,000 or 20,000 soldiers from Hadad of Damascus. This is the king of Aram. We get 700 chariots and 10,000 soldiers from Irhulene of Hamath. And this is kind of interesting. 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers from King Ahab of Israel, who we looked at with Elijah on Mount Carmel. So one of the things that Ahab does that's right is he actually goes out to battle with a large force and helps stop this. But it also shows, when I was talking about these alliances that he's making with other nations, how those alliances come to play. Now, a lot, just like the numbers in Israel, where it talks about 300,000 Amalekites coming up to smite Israel, or Israel having 2,000 soldiers, 200,000 soldiers going against Jericho. It's one of these things when you look back in the ancient Near Eastern history, is the numbers are way overblown, okay? Perhaps the best example of it is when we were going into Iraq the second time and we used the term shock and awe type thing. That's kind of a modern equivalent to it. We never told them what shock and awe was. It was, this is the campaign we're going to be using. In the ancient world, these numbers would be highly exaggerated. So probably with Israel, if you divide those numbers by 10, you probably have a closer to an accurate number if somebody was actually on the ground counting, rather than somebody back in the king's palace. Well, how many soldiers? Oh, they're huge. You know, they're uncountable. Okay, I'll put down 10,000. That sounds good. And how many from this king? Oh, you wouldn't believe it. They covered the ground like locusts. Okay, 20,000 type thing. So probably, you know, if Ahab of Israel had 200 chariots, That's really, phenomenal. And if he had 1,000 foot soldiers, I mean, this is a huge army at that time. But the key thing I want to bring out is here in Shalmaneser's Stele, we actually have a reference to his battle against King Ahab and what he brought out. But this is around 850 BC. The result of Shalmaneser's campaigns and his development is you end up with an Assyrian empire that looks like this towards the end of his reign. He's really conquered large areas, but he's not able to push as far as he wants. And the main reason why he's going west to the coast and then south is that's where the highways went. And so if you want to follow the roads, in other words, you didn't take the highways across the Arabian desert. You had to go where there was food and water and cities. So he went west and then south. And his goal was probably Egypt. Egypt and the countries of like the Hittites, the Assyrians, or the Babylonians, you can always see them as kind of the north and south superpowers. And they're always vying against each other. But where the roads and the highways went, it was up along the coast. Do you have the highways on one of your maps there? You can take a look. I was just wondering, see how really good this study Bible is. Okay, yes. Yeah, so look for a map around this time and see if it's got routes on it. But he's probably headed south to Egypt. But these small nations in between, Phoenicia, Aram, Philistines, they realize that if he's coming south, he just doesn't pass through and pay tolls. He takes everything on the way, and on his way back, he takes everything. It's like the tide sweeping up on the beach and back out. And so that's why they resisted him. But that's about the state of his empire in 840. Now this brings us up talking about his second campaign that he comes in. And his second campaign into this region here, he writes, and this is off the Shalmaneser Stele or the Kirk Monument. It says, 16,020 of his fighting men I felled with the sword. I confiscated 1,121 of his chariots. And it's kind of like 1,121. I mean, it's a pretty accurate number here, but it's a number, even Damascus at that time didn't have over 1,000 chariots. I mean, this is like tanks, You don't have 1,000 tanks at Fort Carson. I don't think you don't. Okay, yeah. About how many do we have? 87. Okay, so there's a great, I had no idea how many were there, but it lets you know that these things are expensive and you just don't have 1,000 of them down there. His cavalry and his military came. To save his life, he fled. I pursued him in his royal city, in the city of Damascus, I can find him. So in his second campaign, 3 years later, he comes down. This time, he's really seeking revenge against this alliance of 10 kings that resisted him. But the key person that he takes off is Damascus. And then he kind of turns around at the Sea of Galilee and heads up north, and he takes the Phoenicians off, Sidon. So now, prior to this, Israel had the Phoenicians and Aram between them and Assyria. Now, it's Israel on the border with Assyria. And so you can see how Assyria is growing, and then this creates problems in what's taking place. Now, after Shalmaneser III, the Assyrian Empire falls into kind of internal squabbles and stuff like that. And so they really turn their attention internally. They're not on a great deal of expansion. And this is really going to come to an end about 100 years later, around 750. So Israel and these small countries are going to have about 100 years. And during this time, Damascus, remember the king of Damascus, Hadad got into the city of Damascus. And Shalmaneser wasn't able to capture him. He confined him in the city, but he wasn't able to capture him. After he left, the king Hadad was able to expand the Aram Empire and kind of rebuild it, so it's on the playing field again. This is another picture of Tiglath-Pileser, his sort of grandson, and you get him talking with one of his other kings that he controls. But here, kneeling in front of him is probably a country that he just controlled, that he just took control of. And they would use these foreign kings as sort of like furniture in the throne room. So in Psalm 110, where it says, talking about the Messiah, it says, until I have put all his enemies as footstools beneath his feet. This is an example of it. They would have these foreign kings that they conquered. These guys would go around crawling everywhere. And when King Tiglath-Pileser needed a break, he had something to put his foot on. Or when he sat down, he could put his foot on this guy. It was an act of humiliation to show how great he was, that these other kings or empires are now just treated as like a pillow for your feet type thing. Now, down in Israel, we're going to turn our attention here during this time around 740 to 730. What we have is some troubles that takes place down here on these provinces on the border of the Assyrian Empire. And in 2 Kings 16, right before our story starts, I got to check my time here because I totally blew the time last week. I wasn't watching it. I was always like, I got 5 minutes left. What happens is in 2 Kings 16, we get this interesting story. It says, in the 17th year of the reign of Pekah of Ramaliah, Jotham's son, Ahaz, became king of Judah. So now we've got Ahaz. I was telling you a bit in the little timeline down there in Judah. He offered sacrifices, burned incense on the high place on the hills and under every green tree. At that time, King Rezin, this is the grandson of King Hadad of Damascus, King Rezin of Syria and King Pekah, son of Remaliah of Israel, attacked Jerusalem, and they besieged Ahaz, but they weren't able to conquer him. So what takes place here during this time is the king of Damascus and the king of Israel go against Judah, and they attack Judah. And it's kind of like, okay, you can kind of understand this. If you want to do some military exploits and go out and conquer people and stuff like that, if you are Israel and you are Aram, it's pretty stupid to go north, because that's where Assyria is. So who's fine picking? Well, there's this little country bumpkin province down here called Judah, and I bet you we could go down there and take them on and get a lot of slaves and gold and pillage the place. And so they go against Judah. And it kind of shows you how bad things have gotten in Israel at this time, that Israel forms an alliance with the king of Damascus to attack their very brothers and sisters in Judah. The problem is that unfortunately King Ahaz in Judah is able to get into Jerusalem and fortify it, and they're not able to conquer the city. So once the siege is kind of lifted a little bit, Ahaz, the king of Judah, sends messengers to who? King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your dependent. March up and rescue me from the power of the king of Assyria and the king of Israel who attacked me. Then Ahaz took the silver and gold that were in the Lord's temple and in the treasuries of the royal palace and sent it as a tribute to the king of Assyria. This is really the nail in the coffin right here. This really seals Israel's fate. They attacked Judah. What does Judah do? Instead of relying on the Lord, they go and they say, hey, if you come and rescue us, we'll be your servants. And 2 Kings 18. The king of Assyria responded favorably to his request. He attacked Damascus and captured it. He deported the people to Kir and executed Rezin, the king of Damascus. And his campaign comes down this way. It just doesn't stop in Damascus, but he goes and he conquers Israel, the 10 tribes to the north, and then he goes south. And remember we were talking about the Philistines? This is really the end of the Philistines. He goes right down to what is the modern-day Gaza Strip, conquers all that region there. Now, the Assyrians had a policy when they conquered other nations, and we'll see this taking place in 2 Kings also. When they conquered a nation, they would take the people there off in slavery. And some of these steles and monuments have pictures of it, and the way they would do it to make sure that everybody they conquered, gets to where they want them to be slaves, they would take a long rope with a spike on the end of it, and they would come up to a person and say, okay, you're number one, and then right through the hand, over here, number 2, through the hand, number 3. And so everybody is stitched together in a long rope like that. And that's how they would carry them off into slavery. Then they would go to servants of theirs that were loyal, people that sent men to fight in the army or gave tribute. But there might have been famine or something like that in their land. They would say, hey, have we got a deal for you, the people in maybe Tyre or Rezin? They would say, have we got a deal for you? You guys have been loyal to the king. How would you like some Mediterranean beachfront property? The houses are already built. The cities are there. A bit broken down, but they're still there. The vineyards, the orchards are there. The wells are dug. You can move in and set up shop there as long as you're loyal to us. So they would take all the people off as slaves, and then they would bring their people in and resettle it and make it loyal. And this is the way they took care of their lands. So the result here at the end, my highlighting's a little bit, but the light yellow, sort of like the highlighter yellow up there, this is now Assyria proper. The light orange and the light blue for Israel and Judah, these are now vassal states. So they are subject to the king of Assyria, but he lets their king kind of be his spokesman, like his governor. They're employed by the king of Assyria. They're not governors themselves. And Philistia, the same thing. It's a province of Assyria. So this is the state that we come up to at the end of 2 Kings chapter 16, moving into 2 Kings 17, which is our story today. So 2 Kings 17 starts off, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, became the king over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned. So we got these two kings, Hoshea in Israel, Ahaz in Jerusalem. And he reigned 9 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, not only as the kings of Israel who were before him did. And Shalmaneser, so remember I said you need just to know 2. Okay, Shalmaneser and Tiglath-Pileser. Here's the second Shalmaneser. Okay, this is his grandson from the guy we looked at before. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him. And Hoshea became his servant and paid him tribute. So you can see he's a vassal state to Assyria. But the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea. He finds conspiracy in the king of Israel. He had sent messengers to the king of Egypt and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria. So every year he's supposed to be sending gold and silver and women and men to fight and chariots and all this sort of stuff off as sort of taxes to Assyria. But he stops doing that. And instead, he's making overtures with Egypt, the superpower in the south. Well, you just don't do that with a nation like Assyria. This is just really bad news. So the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. 3 years the superpower Assyria is waylaying Israel. I mean, they're not leaving very much. There's probably no stone not turned over in that region there. In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried Israel away into exile to Assyria, and settled in Halah and Habor on the river of Gozan and the cities of the Medes. And so what takes place here is the red line is the king of Assyria coming down and waging war against Israel for the king's treachery. And then the dotted yellow line is the people being carried away off into captivity. And at this point in time, really, the 10 tribes of the north cease to exist. Their story is no longer told. When you meet a person like Paul, who says he's from the tribe of Benjamin, or other Jews in the New Testament that say, I'm from this tribe or that tribe, the only way they survived is that when they saw the Assyrian king coming, is they fled south to Judah for refugee. So that's the only way that these nations or these tribes got preserved. The result at the end of the story here is, by the end of the story here, the Assyrian Empire has expanded. The other thing it's done is, what I've got here is that what you don't have in the biblical account is they go south into Egypt. And one of the reasons why King Hoshea in Israel was trying to make a treaty with Egypt is he realized that Egypt saw the writing on the wall, and he thought, well, if I can make this treaty with them, they'll send their army up here and kind of protect us. But he bet on the wrong horse. Assyria will then swallow up all of Egypt. And it just really shows you how large this gets. The little orange area in the middle is Judah that's left. It's a province of Assyria, but they still have a king, and they still have freedom to worship the way they want. They've got some freedom within it, and they're not carried off as slaves or exiles like the people of Israel were. And then I was saying that that's kind of like the overarching world history. And I was saying that one of the things that you need to look at in the biblical story is, if I've been telling the story and we're looking at it from the outside, looking at these huge macro historical moves and things like that are taking place, in the biblical account, it's being told from an insider's point of view. It's kind of like looking at somebody's family, looking at their family dynamics from the outside, and then having the son or the daughter inside the family tell the story later on. You get two very, very different perspectives, and the person on the inside oftentimes sees connections or ideas that those on the outside would never have a clue to. And so in 2 Kings 17:9, we have an interjection here where the person who's chronicling this history now throws in their history, which is a lot what Steve was talking about. You get the theology and the rationale. Why did Israel fall? Why did 10 of the tribes just disappear? Why have we lost so much of the land? And he writes, this happened because the Israelites sinned against the Lord their God, and who brought them up from the land of Egypt and freed them from the power of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods. They observed other practices of the nations whom the Lord had driven out from before Israel, and they followed the example of the kings of Israel. Israel said these things about the Lord their God that were not right. Let me see. What do you got? Yeah, it ends there. And so Israel is carried off into captivity. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting, because I got a minute here to bring it, is when you come to the New Testament, you meet these people called the Samaritans. And you go, well, who are the Samaritans and what are they doing here? Well, if you go into 2 Kings chapter 18, you have the story of what I was telling you about, how the Assyrians would take people off as captives, and then they'd bring other people in and give them the nice, beachfront property in the hill country along the Mediterranean, the wine and the olive presses and stuff like this. When they bring their people in, what's happening is the rains aren't coming, lions are attacking people in the hills, bees are swarming and attacking people. Everything's going wrong. Now, some of the people get left behind. If you're old, decrepit, lame, blind, really they kind of look at you and they go, well, you're just not slave material. They would leave these people behind because there's no point in taking them. I mean, it costs more to ship them off than they're worth. So they would leave them behind. So as they bring in these people and they resettle the land of what used to be Israel, they start going, why are all these things happening? This is supposed to be a good land, a land of milk and honey. What's going on? And the people there start telling them about the covenant of God with the land. And they send a report back to the king of Assyria saying, hey, things are not so rosy here. And the people here say it's because of this. And the king of Assyria goes and then finds a priest that he took off as captive and sends him back. And this guy looks like a pretty good person from the little bit we got. He tells them about the Lord. He tells them about the covenant. He tells them about the history of Israel. And he settles in Bethel. Now what happens then is, because of this split, and they only know the history of Israel up to the split between Solomon's children. They only know that part of the split there. They only accept the first 5 books of the Bible, Joshua and Judges, Ruth, and I think Samuel. Everything after that they think is an invention by the people of Judah. They added stuff to the scriptures. And so they begin to teach and worship and form religion based on this. And they become known in the New Testament as the Samaritans. And so you can really see how from 722 BC onward, how what took place back then had consequences all the way down. And you also see how little things like treaties that King Ahab of Israel made with Aram and Sidon and these other countries had such disastrous long-term consequences. Yeah, it brought them wealth and security in the short term, but in the long term it really had dire consequences for the nation. And the thing that the person in 2 Kings does in the second half of the chapter is he explains why these ideas have consequences. They give you the theological rationale. In other words, they told you what happened in 6 verses, and then they spend 17 verses telling you why it happened. Okay? And so you see where for them the trump card falls. It's on the theology side of it rather than, oh yeah, they got carried off as slaves. Now let me tell you why, the really cool theology part of it. So I'm going to close there today so that I don't infringe upon the worship service and so that the choir and everybody else can get ready. But if you have questions or you want to talk about it a little bit more, we can discuss it later on. Oh, one of the things I want to say, because of Don's cute announcement during the service, and pronunciation of Baal, or the incorrect way to say it, is when I studied Greek the first time in university, I had a professor. He used to be the head of languages at Stanford and then retired, and so he was teaching classical Greek. So I learned Greek from his perspective. Then when I went to seminary, I purposely failed the Greek quiz because I wanted to take Greek again. I wanted to review the material and learn it again. This time the professor I had was from southern Texas. And she always liked to go by Miss Ann Bowman. Not Mrs. or anything like that. It was Miss Ann. And then when I went to do advanced studies with Donald Hagner at Fuller, I was helping teach the Greek program there. And one day we're sitting in his office discussing something, and he just stops and he goes, you know, I really can't put my finger on it, but when you pronounce Greek, it sounds like there's a southern twang to it. And then when I went to England, in England what happened with the Reformation, especially with Erasmus at Cambridge, what happened is you had these theologians and biblical scholars who were trained in Latin that learned Greek at the Reformation. And when they learned Greek, they learned it with a Latin pronunciation. So when I went to England, words like we would say agape for God's unconditional love, in English the way, because of you got this Latin retread, obviously we're saying it wrong. Yeah. It's agape. And so in the department there, we were having a colloquium on some aspect of Romans chapter 5, and we're talking about the Greek text there. And the professor, the head professor of Greek, just, I read like a sentence in Greek, and he just starts slapping the table and laughing. He goes, "Oh, Mr. Parris, that is so delightful. Can you read that again?" So the thing I always told my students was, if you can read it so we know what you're talking about, that's good enough for me.